Hi, and welcome to another video on my in my Lucy Letby Talks series. This video is about the probability of a nurse being on duty for a certain number of deaths. And of course, this is something that certainly the pro-guilt camp, if I can call it that, has fallen back on, if you like, whenever anything is thrown at them in relation to the medical evidence or the so-called confession evidence. They go, well, yeah, but she was on duty for so many of the deaths, so she must be guilty. So this is kind of about addressing this point that the pro-guilt camp makes and asking the question, is that fair? Is there anything more that we should be looking at? And the answer is yes, absolutely there is. And the other thing to mention, of course, is that this question is where everything started. Before anything else, the paediatricians had noticed that Lucy, back in the beginning of July 2015, they'd noticed that Lucy had been present for the 3 deaths in June 2015, in other words, over the previous month. And that really was the mainstay of their argument for a long time. So hopefully this talk is going to address this question. There's a little bit of maths in it, but I promise you not too much. So let's just look at a summary of what this talk is going to cover. As I've mentioned, the pro-guilt camp have noted on various occasions that Lucy Letby was on duty for a high proportion of the deaths, and that the probability of this occurring by chance is practically zero, is negligible. And because of that, they argue, Letby must have intentionally caused the deaths, i.e. she murdered the babies. This video, I hope, is going to explain why the pro-guilt camp is wrong to argue that this probability is very low. And in fact, hopefully I'm going to show that the probability is in fact really very high. Just a few recaps first, looking at news over the last couple of years with respect to further deaths that you may remember after the trial or the retrial. Cheshire Police announced that they were investigating other deaths at the Countess of Chester, also deaths at Liverpool Women's Hospital. And I thought it'd be good just to quickly look at where we are with that. So yes, back in 2025, they said that some of the 17 deaths were no longer under investigation because a natural or biological cause had been identified. Didn't say how many, just said some. And while all 17 deaths have been examined, only 2 of the 17 remained the subject of ongoing police investigation. So obviously included in that 17 are the 7 deaths at the Countess that she was charged with. In fact, it was 8 really, because although baby K wasn't a murder charge, baby K was one of the 17 deaths. So essentially what this is saying is of the other 9 deaths, only 2 at this point in time remained the subject of ongoing investigation. And then earlier this year, the CPS said that it had reviewed evidence into these further allegations, but had decided that the evidential test was not met in any of these cases, whether it was the other 2 deaths or incidents that were non-fatal collapses. So that's where we are with the deaths. In other words, there's no more deaths that are being investigated now, which I think is important. And it's also just worth looking at this difference between the local CPS and the national CPS. So the original charging decision that I think was made in November 2020, that was made by the local CPS Mersey and Cheshire's complex casework unit. And there's been questions as to whether it should have been the local CPS making that decision. Partly because the recent decision that I just mentioned, not to bring further charges, was made by the national CPS. In other words, this national division called the Special Crime and Counter-Terrorism Division. And so why were the first sets of decisions made by the local CPS and the latest set of decisions made by the national CPS? And it's a difficult question to answer, because if you look at the sorts of cases that the national, serious crime and counter-terrorism division, the sorts of crimes that they will make decisions on, it's to do with, well, there's a list here: deaths in custody or following police contact, assisted suicide, serious criminal allegations against police officers, corporate manslaughter, gross negligence, medical manslaughter, election officials, cases involving high-profile individuals such as MPs, criminal allegations against CPS and National Crime Agency employees, and leaks of confidential information by public officials to journalists. At least these are the serious crimes that will be investigated. It will also investigate terrorism-related crimes, but as far as serious crimes are concerned, this is the list, and nowhere in there is deaths in a healthcare setting. And by the way, that list I just cited, that is directly from the cps.gov.uk website. There are those who've pointed to another set of types of crime that get investigated by this national team, and that includes deaths in a healthcare setting, where there are deaths where there are more than a certain number of deaths. So clearly at some point that changed. It's not clear exactly when it changed, but it might have something to do with why the local CPS was making the decisions back in 2020. But it doesn't quite explain why the national CPS made the recent decision. So that's really interesting. Why was that? If the sorts of deaths, crimes that alleged crimes that we're talking about were not on that list. And of course, it'll be interesting, because if the case gets referred back to the Court of Appeal by the CCRC, and the Court of Appeal quashes the convictions, it will, I think, then send the case back to the CPS to ask them, do you want to retry Letby for any of these charges? And the question is, well, which bit of the CPS will be making that decision? Because if it's the national CPS that made the latest decision, then it's quite hard to understand why the original trials, the original allegations met the evidential test, but the later incidents didn't. So it's hard to understand why they wouldn't just say, no, we've decided it doesn't meet the evidential test. Now, what have the pro-guilt camp said at various times in relation to Letby's presence? Well, you may remember the prosecuting barrister Nick Johnson referring to Letby being a constant malevolent presence. Other terms were used, whether by the prosecution or by prosecution witnesses, like she was a common denominator, that when things took a turn, she was always there. So these are all, they're obviously not references to a specific probability in terms of a number, but they're all references to her being present for a lot of the deaths, and the implication being that that's so unlikely that she must have been harming the babies. This is another one from Judith Moritz. We've discovered that 13 babies died during Lucy Letby's last year in the neonatal unit, and she was on shift for every single one of them. I mean, that's 13 out of 13, obviously, is extraordinary. But then the BBC had to make a retraction, because in fact it was 12 of 13, not 13 of 13. And you may well think, well, 12 of 13 is still high, and yes, it is, but we'll, over the course of this video, we'll understand why actually that's not correct. And then you may remember that Dr. Dowie Evans, the retired paediatrician who was engaged by Cheshire Police to be its chief medical investigator, he was in the Telegraph last November talking about the statistical analysis that he had done, and he had managed to get hold of Lucy Letby's shift calendar, combine that with the data that he had for when deaths happened, and came up with this analysis. So 9.2% of Letby's shifts there was a death, and when she wasn't on duty, a death occurred on just 0.3% of shifts. And in fact, Evans contacted me about this and asked me to appraise it, and I went back to him setting out why I thought his analysis was incorrect. I then also sent it to a number of professional statisticians who also came back with a lot of criticism of this approach, basically saying that it was garbage. But anyway, you get the idea. These are all ways in which the pro-guilt camp has invoked this assertion that she was on duty for a high number of the deaths. Now, here's a name that, having mentioned Dowie Evans, this name may also spring to mind. Professor Roy Meadow, who was a paediatrician, and he was the expert witness in the Sally Clark case, and who was charged with murdering her two children. And Meadow came up with this probability of 1 in 73 million, which is the probability of both children dying of cot death, on the basis that the probability of one dying of cot death was 1 in, I think it's 8,600. And so therefore the probability of both children dying was 1 in 8,600 squared, which I think is 1 in 73 million. Now, it was pointed out later that this figure wasn't right because of genetic factors, meant that if one child died of cot death, there was a much greater likelihood that the other child would die of cot death. So that needed to be taken account of. And then there were gender factors as well. Baby boys are much more likely to die of cot death than baby girls, and Sally Clark's children were both boys. So that was one reason why this 1 in 73 million figure was wrong. But the main reason why it was wrong was because of what's called the lottery fallacy. And I'm going to hopefully explain to you what the lottery fallacy is and why it's so important with respect to Sally Clark's case, or and indeed Lucy Letby's case, but any case where there's some sort of spike in mortality that gets blamed on an individual. And this is all to do with the lottery fallacy. Just quickly on that, the lottery fallacy is just confusion between the probability of a particular person winning the lottery, which of course is very low, and the probability of someone winning the lottery, which of course is 100%. Anyway, a lot more to come on that. Now, Roy Meadow, Sally Clark, I think, as many of you will know, was released, exonerated after she was given a life sentence, but then released after 3 years, when various things came to light, and actually not to do with this probability calculation, but to do with something that wasn't disclosed to the defence. But a large part of the reason why she was wrongly convicted was because of Roy Meadow's evidence. And it's not just Sally Clark. It's not just Sally Clark's wrongful conviction that he was involved with. but a number of other women as well. And here are just some of them. I'm sure there are others, but these are the ones that I know about. You have a number of, well, they're all mothers, apart from Angela and Ian Gay, who were adoptive parents. And what I've given you there in brackets is their sentence, but the number of years of that sentence that were actually served. So yes, of course, tragic that years were lost by these women and Ian Gay, but it's even more tragic that these lives have been destroyed, and I'm sure other lives have been destroyed by the likes of Roy Meadow and Dowie Evans and others like David Southall, the sort of cabal of doctors who essentially are Munchausen by proxy fanatics, where they think that women are out to harm people or babies in their care in order to get attention. And you can see that these doctors have, over the last few decades, appeared as expert witnesses at trials, often resulting in the women getting wrongly convicted. And it's just terrifying to think how many lives have been destroyed by these men. So here's a question, and I just want this to sort of stay with you as the video proceeds. Dave wins the lottery, and the probability of winning the lottery is 1 in a billion. Therefore, Dave must have cheated. So is there a flaw in this logic? And if so, what is it? So I'll leave that with you. And part of the issue here is that human beings are very poor at judging probabilities, where we have the sort of mental shortcuts, heuristics, cognitive biases that affect our judgment when it comes to probabilities. And there's a whole list of them here, different biases, different heuristics. If you want to pause and just read those, please do. But the issue is that we have a difficulty with probability. It's not intuitive. And probability of a particular event may intuitively be low, but in fact is very high. And here's an example of that. So in a room of 30 randomly chosen people, what's the probability that 2 of them share the same birthday? Well, it can't be higher than 1%, can it? Possibly 10%. The answer, in fact, is 71%. And I know that some of you out there will have known about that. Some of you out there will have realized that probability is quite high. But most people I ask, they either usually say 1%, some of them say 10%, very few say 71%. And the problem, what's going on here is that what we think about is the probability of ourselves having the same birthday as any of the other 29 people, and forget that actually got to look at the probability of all of those 29 having the same birthday as each other. So that's kind of the mental mistake that we made. And I'm just giving you this as an example of why, on the face of it, some will look at what the Countess paediatrician said. She was present for so many of the deaths, and automatically think, well, the probability of that must be very low. And I'm going to show you why that's not the case. But part of the issue here is this poor intuition that we have about maths. Now, there's been no serious attempt, at least not as far as I can see, by the pro-innocence camp to counter the assertion by the pro-guilt camp that this coincidence of Letby being on duty for so many deaths is virtually impossible. And why is that? Well, I think that's for a couple of reasons. Partly it's the data and the access to the data. We don't really the publicly available data that we need in order to do this analysis is simply not available. I've got a lot of good data, which is what I've based this video on, but most people don't have that. And also, this analysis probably needs to be done formally by a professional statistician, and either they don't have access to this data or they simply don't have the time to do this sort of analysis. Now, I've done it, but I've been doing statistics throughout my professional career in the financial industry. So whilst what I might have done may not be exactly the same as what a professional statistician would have done, in some ways it sets out something that a professional statistician can look at and say, yeah, that it may not be exactly what I would have done, but it all makes sense. And I think also, because I'm not a professional statistician and spent a lot of my time in the investment world having to dumb down investing to clients who were not sort of mathematically minded, I think I'm quite well placed to be able to explain to people about what this question is to do with the probability of a nurse being on duty for a certain number of deaths, where a professional statistician would probably have will probably lose most people because of all of the technical complications to do with the maths. Now, here, talking of statisticians, here's a medical statistician whose name you may have heard of, Professor Jane Hutton. And she was, and these are quotes from The Guardian here, she was approached by an officer on the investigation in April 2018. Without naming Letby, he asked Hutton whether she could put a figure on how likely it was to be just a coincidence for one member of staff to be on duty during all the deaths collapses. In other words, this is the question that this video is addressing. In fact, it looks like in this email there was a mention of i.e., probably should have been e.g., but i.e. 1 in a million, etc. So clearly the police have it in their heads that this is something that other investigations have looked at. They may have known about this probability that was cited by Roy Meadow. The article then went on to say this is what Jane Hutton responded, basically saying this is how she would conduct this whole question into probabilities and what was going on at the Countess. And then Cheshire Police signed a consultancy agreement with her, but then basically contacted her again in 23 years later, having not had any contact in the meantime, 3 years later, to say that they had been instructed by the prosecutor to stop engaging with her, to stop pursuing that line of investigation. And there's obviously a lot of questions going on as to whether the CPS should have been allowed to make that sort of instruction to the police, to tell them to stop pursuing a line of investigation. And there's also a disclosure issue here as well. And this is actually a quote from the CPS website, just about why disclosure is so important. And a couple of other quotes there from the CPS website. So in the case of Jane Hutton and what was disclosed about that, neither the initial engagement with Hutton nor the CPS instruction to the police to drop their line of inquiry into the validity of the statistical evidence in the case were disclosed to Letby's defence team, The Guardian understands. Which really is quite shocking, because clearly it would have been helpful to the defence to have known, A, that the police contacted Jane Hutton, but more importantly that they were instructed by the CPS to stop engaging with her. Both of those would have been very helpful, and therefore both of them amount to a serious non-disclosure issue. So let's just summarise where we are up to this point. Cheshire Police were clearly sympathetic to the doctors, Brearey and Jayaram, when they met with them in 2017, and they were clearly not at all sceptical about what they were being told. And one of those things would have been this issue of the present. So it seems as if this issue of a lack of understanding in relation to probability was really involved from a very, very early stage. And the police clearly were convinced by what they were told about Letby being present for many of the deaths. And probably they thought, well, they should get a Roy Meadows style 1 in 73 million figure, which indeed is what the Guardian understands. The Guardian saw in an email is exactly what the police asked Jane Hutton to do, to come up with a 1 in a million type figure. Extraordinarily, they didn't stop to ponder the fact that Meadows' Sally Clark calculation had been proven to be catastrophically wrong. So why on earth would they have wanted a 1 in a million figure if they knew that? And if they didn't, well, they should have. And perhaps even more extraordinarily, it was Cheshire Police who had investigated Sally Clark, the same police force. So even more reason for them to have been aware of the errors that were made with respect to Professor Roy Meadow. And I suppose the only thing that can count in their favour is at least they asked Jane Hutton rather than a paediatrician. And of course, the paediatrician that they would have asked would have been Dowie Evans, and because he would have given them what they wanted. But in light of this, and in light of the disclosure issue, I think they may well come to regret that. So the probability that we want to calculate is this: if there are big N shifts, big K deaths, what is the probability that a nurse who works small n shifts is on duty for small k deaths? And look away now if you're squeamish about maths, but this probability, the applicable probability function, is called the hypergeometric distribution. And there's the maths there. It's not necessary to understand this for the purposes of this video, but just to show you that there is a very specific mathematical formula for calculating these probabilities, assuming that you have these four variables. And just one more thing to note: this probability function, is only applicable if big K and small n are independent. So with respect to Letby, the equivalence of big N, big K, small n, and small k, which generally relate to population size, what's called the number of success states, the number of draws, and the number of successes. These correspond in the Letby case to respectively to total shifts, total deaths. I apologise that essentially total deaths is the equivalent of success states. It's appalling to think of a death as a success, but it's just the way that the mathematical language works. Small n is the number of shifts worked by Letby, and small k is the number of deaths that Letby was on shift for. So let's get into the real detail now.
This table is of the 18 deaths in my database that I'm using for the various calculations that I'm going to do. Ignore those two little red triangles there. Now, just going across the top, looking at the data points that I've got, I've numbered all the deaths. Then there's baby initials there, obviously redacted the ones where the babies were on the indictment. I've got the indictment letter there, the Evans number, which is the number that he assigned to the cases that he appraised when he first joined the investigation, whether the birth was a multiple birth or not. A lot of this is information that I don't use for the purposes of the calculation in this video, but it's all useful information. I've then got the date and the precise time of the admission onto the neonatal unit, where the admission was from, whether it was from the maternity unit or another hospital, or the operating theatre, whether the death was an in-house death or what's called a transfer death, where a baby was a patient at the Countess and was then transferred to another hospital, a level 3 hospital, where the baby died. The date and precise time of the death, or in the case of transfer deaths, the date and precise time of the transfer, whether the death occurred on the night shift or the day shift. If it was a transfer death, where to where was the baby transferred, how long was the baby in the neonatal unit for, then whether Letby was on duty or not. If she wasn't, whether she was on duty for the prior shift, whether the death was on the indictment, what the charge was. The 7 at the top there are murder charges, and then further down you can see baby K, which she was an attempted murder charge, although in fact initially she'd also been a murder charge, but that was dropped a few months prior to the start of the trial. And then finally, whether Evans, when he first appraised each of these cases, what he said in terms of whether he thought there was something suspicious in relation to the baby's care. And just looking down there, for example, you can see he thought that baby EW, death number 9, was suspicious, but that death wasn't on the indictment. He said that baby K was not suspicious, but she ended up on the indictment, etc. So you know that in previous videos of mine I've talked about the discrepancies with respect to his opinions, but you can also see them here as well. I've then divided the 18 babies into 6 groups. You've got the 7 at the top there, which the 7 deaths that were on the indictment as murder charges. The next 3 are deaths that Letby was on duty for, but the deaths were not on the indictment. Then 2 deaths where Letby was on duty the prior shift, but the deaths were not on the indictment. Number 13 there is a death that she wasn't on duty either on the particular shift or the shift before, and it was not on the indictment. Babies 14, 15 and 16 there. The first 2 are babies where Letby, all 3 are babies which were transfer deaths. And then the last 2, 17 and 18. 17 is a transfer death where Letby was not on duty, didn't end up on the indictment, and number 18 is a baby who died on the maternity unit. So these are all of this table comprises all of the data and more, but all of the data that I'm using for the purposes of this calculation that I'm doing. And indeed, the other information that I've got, of course, is Letby's shift calendar I use that I got from Evans, which of course I've used to populate the columns on the right there with respect to whether Letby was on duty. There's a death in number 17 where I don't have the shift data, so I've assumed that she wasn't on duty on the basis that she worked around 25% of the time, so chances are she wasn't on duty. And then also baby 18, which where the baby died on the maternity unit, and I don't have details of the time of death. And the reason for including that is because, of course, often neonatal nurses are present at the birth, so that's a good reason to include that as well.
So what do we know? Well, we know that Letby worked 162 12-hour shifts and 1 8-hour shift in the 396 days that covered the index period, during which there were 792 12-hour shifts, 396 times 2. Although, in fact, in reality, there aren't 12-hour shifts because there's a half an hour handover period at between each shift. So, in reality, these 12-hour shifts are actually 12.5-hour shifts. But that's not going to make any material difference to calculations that I've done for this video. What else do we know? We know precisely which shifts she worked. And we know that there were 18 deaths between March 15 and June 16, and we know precisely when 16 of them occurred. So what we want to do is look at different scenarios. When you calculate a scenario, you're talking about what are the various assumptions, what are the variables that go into that scenario, into that calculation. And the scenario that the pro-guilt camp like to refer to is the scenario where Letby is on duty for 15 of the 16 deaths. These 16 is 13 in-house deaths and 3 transfer deaths, and the 15 includes not only the shift that she was on, but also the prior shift. But this is the number that the likes of Liz Hull or Judith Moritz have quoted in articles and said, look, this is so unlikely that it happened by chance. And so what are the assumptions that we vary for, that we adjust for in each scenario? Well, the number of deaths included in each calculation, whether the total number or the deaths that Letby was on duty for, those absolutely do not have to be 15 of 16. There are all sorts of different combinations of deaths that are relevant. Whether the prior shift should be included in the calculation, and because there's an argument that says that it absolutely should not be included on the basis that if a baby is attacked, the effects of that attack will manifest extremely quickly. So why do we need to look at the prior shift? But the prosecution argue that one should, not necessarily correct. An important one is to take account of this dependency that relates to Letby being called for duty when the intensive care nursery was busy. And of course, when the intensive care nursery is busy, that means mortality risk is higher. It means more babies are likely to die. And the reason why Letby was called for duty when the IC nursery was busy was because you had this thing called the QIS, which was a specific qualification that allowed her to be able to look after babies in intensive care. And in my last video, I actually used the data to confirm that she was actually called for duty when the intensive care nursery was busy. In other words, deaths didn't follow her, but she followed deaths, and that's absolutely a critical point. And then finally, the lottery fallacy, which I've mentioned a couple of times now, but it's absolutely an essential adjustment that needs to be incorporated. So let's look at the different parametric values with respect to scenario 1. So the total number of shifts, big N 792, which you'll remember from a previous slide. Total number of deaths, big K 16. The number of shifts that Letby did, 163. The deaths that Letby was on shift for, 15, or 15 or more, which means 15 or 16. Do we include the prior shift? Yes. Do we include transfer deaths? Yes. Do we include the death on the maternity unit? No, because we don't know when that occurred. Do we include the death in March 2015? Again, no, because we don't know exactly when that occurred, and indeed whether she was on duty. Do we include deaths that weren't on the indictment? Because let's remember, there's what the prosecution or the prosecution camp is arguing here is in relation to all deaths, whether they were on the indictment or not. And so if these deaths that were not on the indictment are being included, what is the pro-guilt camp saying? Are they saying that, yeah, but she must have committed those as well? Well, obviously we know now that the reason why she wasn't charged with those is because they couldn't find enough evidence to charge her. Also because the original decision in relation to the 7 deaths was made by the the local CPS, it's very possible that the national CPS would have made the decision that the evidential test had not been reached with respect to those 7 either. So anyway, the point is, should we include the deaths that were not on the indictment? Anyway, in this case, we have included them, because that's what the prosecution would have wanted. Do we include the 3 deaths in June 2015?
Given that suspicions arose after the 3 deaths in June 2015, there's an argument to say, well, let's exclude those and look at the probability of her being on duty for deaths thereafter.
Do we adjust for this dependency I spoke about? Well, no, because the prosecution isn't adjusting for that. Are we adjusting for the lottery fallacy? Again, no. What we want to do here is we want to start off with the likelihood of the scenario which the prosecution like to refer to. And so what is that? What is that probability? Well, it's 0.00000005%, or 1 in just over 2 billion. And that is obviously an incredibly tiny likelihood, and which is why the prosecution is saying she must be guilty. There's no way that she could have been on duty for that many deaths by chance. Or maybe not. This table seeks to just show you, and again you can refer back to this if you like, the parametric values that pertain to each of the 14 scenarios that I've looked at. And where you can see something highlighted in bold, that's where the parameter value has changed in relation to the previous scenarios. So you'll see scenario 2 there. I didn't include the maternity death in that scenario 1 calculation, but I did include it in the scenario 2, and assumed that Letby was not on duty for that, because she was on duty for around 25% of the time, and therefore it's more likely than not that she wasn't on duty. And you can see in bold where I've made the change in relation to each new scenario. So let's now talk in more detail about the lottery fallacy. So we've been calculating the first 12 scenarios. We've been calculating the probability of a particular nurse being on duty for a certain number of deaths, but that's the wrong calculation to be making. We should adjust for the possibility that Letby was simply the unluckiest nurse, the equivalent of the lottery winner being the luckiest lottery ticket holder. And so the possibility that Letby was the unluckiest nurse at the Countess, but also the unluckiest nurse across the NHS, because you've got to appreciate that for a nurse to be accused, she has to be unlucky. It's very, very difficult to charge a nurse with harming babies if they weren't present for most of the deaths or incidents, which of course is the case with most nurses. You have to be extremely unlucky to be on duty for 15 of 16 deaths. But taking account of this is what's called the lottery fallacy. And indeed, this was the tragic error that saw Sally Clark wrongly convicted. It wasn't the genetic or the gender factors.
It was the fact that they picked Sally Clark. Suspicions arose about her because both of her sons died, and then said, what is the probability of that happening? It's a bit like picking the winner of the lottery and then saying, what's the chance of them winning the lottery? And saying, well, it's so small, they must have cheated. It's a ridiculous way of looking at things. They're basically double counting the fact that both of her children died.
And you've got to remember that
in Letby's case,
the suspicions that she had harmed babies were based only on her having been present for many of the deaths. The evidence of inflicted harm was specious at best. And you may recall that Dr. Stephen Brearey, one of the two main accusing doctors, along with Dr. Jayaram, he had said that the staffing and the acuity, neither of them were responsible for the elevated mortality. And whilst he presented some supporting evidence for his argument about the staffing, he presented no evidence at all in relation to his assertion that acuity could not, higher acuity in 2015 and 2016 could not explain the spike in 2015 and 2016. And I think, as you saw from a previous video of mine, it could well be that the acuity was responsible for the spike, and the acuity was higher because of the closures in North Wales of the maternity unit there. And of course, Dr. Brearey, I'm sure, would have been aware of that. But for whatever reason, he chose to say that the higher acuity did not explain the elevated mortality. So scenarios 13 and 14 take account of the lottery fallacy. It's hard to do a quantitative calculation, but that doesn't matter. What matters is the concept. Scenario 13 looks at whether Letby was the unluckiest nurse at the Countess. And scenario 14 looks at things much more broadly, essentially looking at the perhaps tens of thousands of nurses who have been working on a ward somewhere in the UK over some sort of period where there is a spike in mortality. Because you have to put Letby's presence in the context of all of these wards where there would have been a spike in mortality. And we know that there are many, many spikes in mortality across the NHS, not just in neonatal units, but in other sorts of ward as well. So these are the results. The probability that I've calculated in relation to each of these 14 scenarios. Scenario 1 there, and the scale here is a logarithmic scale, base 10 logarithmic scale. So you can see scenario 1 there is the probability I mentioned earlier. I think 0 point, then 7 zeros, and then 5. And then as we go through each scenario, the probability of her being present gets greater and greater and greater, such that when you take account of the lottery fallacy, we're getting really quite close to the probability of her being present, or rather a nurse somewhere being present is getting on for close to 100%. So I hope that that's been helpful. I hope that it hasn't been too complicated. I realize that what I've done is not a formal statistical analysis. So if there are statisticians out there who can help verify my reasoning, which would be useful for all sorts of reasons, then please can they contact me on that email address. Thank you very much indeed for listening. Bye-bye.